Hey everyone, if I can have your attention. That works. Alright guys, so I'll introduce myself. First, my name is Steve Palacini. I'm co-founder of HustleCo Workspace. My business partner Hussam is right there in the white shirt between the plants waving. And yeah, we're really excited to have Adam here talk tonight. Just to give you guys a bit of a background, I met him at a startup drinks event and was chatting with him, and then it's like, okay, he's working for Google at the time, but he's thinking of coming back to Calgary. I was like, this is awesome. So kind of kept in touch, and I was telling him about HustleCo and how I wanted to eventually come to a talk at the space. We had just opened up, and it was great. We kept in touch. I kept trying to drag his ass out to the Startup Grind events, which is, I volunteer with Startup Grind. The director's here, Chad, wherever he is. Chad. And then last Startup Grind event, I was chatting with him and realized he had all these crazy stories from Silicon Valley, some awesome ones, things that we don't even have a clue or concept about because we're here in Calgary. So, and what we can do differently as a city. So we're excited to hear about that tonight. And yeah, HustleCo, we're a co-working space, a marketing incubator. We just launched last August, and our mission here is to support entrepreneurs, do whatever we can to support solopreneurs, get them started. And yeah, we've been doing workshops for the past year as well. So keep an eye out for that. Stay tuned on our meetup group, our social media. And without further ado, I introduce to you guys Adam Birkin.
Thank you, everyone. So Silicon Valley and why move back? Who's here to hear stories of Silicon Valley? Who's here to learn like Calgary versus Silicon Valley, in my opinion? Well, I got lots of stories and I got lots of opinions, so let's go. All right, so about me. Who am I and why are you here? I grew up in Calgary, and I went off to university in Toronto. During the 99-2000 peak of the tech bubble, I did a one-year internship in Silicon Valley at a company called Altera. They make programmable logic chips. I really loved California, and I couldn't wait to get back. But after university, I went to Seattle, to Microsoft for a few years, and I worked on the kernel team there. It was good, but I didn't really like Seattle. So took a year off after that, did some skiing, and then decided it was time to go back to Silicon Valley. Went back to Altera for a year and a half, and then Google came knocking. So I was there for 10 years. I worked on a whole bunch of stuff. I worked on the search infrastructure team. When you type into google.com, you're searching for kittens. That was part of that was my code to like find the kittens.
You're responsible for the cats.
From there, I moved to the Linux kernel team. Obviously, Google runs a lot of machines, and they care that the kernel is well tuned for them. And then I moved into the storage team, which is sort of stuff I'd done at Microsoft, and ended up back at that, particularly flash drives, and then Google Cloud Storage stuff. So while I was at Google, I had 5 kids. Which will become relevant soon in the story. And then in August, I decided to move back to Calgary. So a couple disclaimers here. This is not my former employer's opinions on things, so anything I say is not Google official policy or anything. And I'm not here to tell you secrets. I will not tell you how many machines Google has. That is, not the purpose of this talk. So first, introduction. What is Silicon Valley? Everyone's heard of it. Nobody really knows much about it. So Silicon Valley is this huge area from San Francisco sort of down to San Jose, particularly this area around Stanford University and Mountain View and Palo Alto. Literally, Google's headquarters is across the street from LinkedIn, which is across the street from NASA. These companies are all within a few miles of each other. So it's a great spot to be if you're in high tech. Obviously, there's dozens and dozens of big employers, hundreds of little employers, tons of startup opportunities. And so lots of people live there and work at these companies. It's becoming a Google and Apple dominated place though. Google is the next thing we're talking about. Google is a very large company. Everyone's heard of Google, I hope. and Alphabet, which is the official name of the company now. It started in '98. Larry and Sergey were at Stanford, and they made a little search engine, and they tried to sell it to people. And people were like, how are you going to make money with the search engine? So they couldn't sell it, so they ended up forming a company instead, and worked out for them. They're multi-billionaires now. In 2015, they actually changed the company into Alphabet, which is kind of a holding company. And within that, they have Google, but they have a lot of other little companies as well. YouTube, Nest, Waymo, which is the self-driving car thing. So now it's a huge, huge company. They have over 100 offices around the world, and dozens of those are engineering offices. And dozens of data centers around the world too. You know, and by data center, I mean a warehouse full of computers or multiple warehouses full of computers. The scale of it is mind-boggling now. They have about 90,000 employees today. Half of those work in Silicon Valley, and half of those are in engineering and development, more or less. And their market cap, well, this was about a week ago, 770 billion. I think they're up over 800 billion now. So, you know, larger than most countries. And they make $20 billion a year in profits these days. So that enables them to do some of these crazy, you know, self-driving cars and that kind of thing. So what did I like about Google? What was it like there? The number one thing by far was the people. The people at Google were the best software engineers, the best program managers, the best marketing guys, best everything, right? Obviously the company is very popular, you know, has a good opinion. People flock to it. In terms of just the engineers I worked with, people who are winning the ACM Turing Awards. This is like the Nobel Prize of computer engineering. Vint Cerf is the father of the internet, is his nickname. Pretty good if you can get it. And Ken Thompson was one of the inventors of Unix. You know, so those were guys who just worked at the company, and you'd send an email, and like Ken Thompson would answer your email. Wait, what? It's a little weird. Language creators. At some point, Guido van Rossum, the Python creator, James Gosling, the Java creator, Ken Thompson of Unix, Rob Pike and Ken Thompson created Go. These were the major languages that we use at Google, and the people who created the languages worked at Google. Right? This is a fairly common thing. Like professors worked at Google. So you go and like get the textbook on something and realize, wait, I recognize, but that's my coworker, right? And he literally wrote the book on it. They used to ask you how comfortable are you with, say, Python or with, you know, a programming language or whatever, and they'd ask you on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is I barely know it, right? And 5 is I'm an expert. And 8 was I am involved in the standards process and are driving the language forward. 9 was I wrote the book on it, literally. And 10 was I created the language. Right? So that was, those were the kind of people you worked with. Like, yeah, they were all incredibly smart, but a few of them were like, wow, smart. My favorite people there were the security engineers. These guys, what happened in 2010, the Chinese government, or allegedly the Chinese government, hacked into Google, and Google was like, we cannot let this happen anymore. They hired every security engineer they could, just doubled wages overnight. And so now all the best security engineers work at Google. And in the news last week with the Spectre and Meltdown, those were Google engineers who found them. Most of the big vulnerabilities that are found these days are found by Google. Google doesn't just secure their own stuff. There's no point in securing, you know, the Chrome browser if Windows is taken out. So they're trying to make sure that Windows is secure. They're trying to make sure that the routers on the internet are secure. They're trying to make sure everything is secure, because that's where they're at now, right? They have a great browser, they have a great service. The pipe between them needs to be secure now. And so I really enjoyed talking with those people. It was just one of those things where there were email lists, and you could ask a question, and you know, some guy would jump in, and then you go look him up and go, oh, he's the guy who found Meltdown. Okay, he's answering my questions now. So it was interesting because everyone there has this imposter syndrome, we all call it, right? Where, yeah, we all passed the interview and we got hired, but everyone here is ludicrously smart. And so, like, clearly it was an accident they hired me, right? And it takes about a year before you sort of see this recurring. Everyone who gets hired has that same thought. And you sort of settle in and go, okay, maybe Maybe I barely did clear the bar, but most people barely cleared the bar. Most of the software engineers were great, but had not created a language or an operating system, right? So it was easy to compare yourself to these phenomenal individuals, right? Most of us were good. But it was a great place to work because you had confidence that every single person you talked to just had that minimum bar, right? If you wanted to talk about the statistics of something, everyone knew statistics, like not experts in it, but you could talk, I don't know, but there's a distribution here, there's a variance to this, and they just understood. And so it let conversation be at a much higher level, you could do things a lot quicker. One of my favorite parts of Google. Another thing I enjoyed was the training. So the first thing was these code labs. They had these pages set up where you could go and learn about anything Google does. If I wanted to learn how machine learning works, they had a code lab. So you go and it would say, okay, write this code. Run it on these 100 machines. You could just borrow 100 machines maybe. And then, maybe let's write a search engine. And they had a code lab. Literally, it was let's write a search engine to search the works of Shakespeare. And they'd tell you how to create the index, how to create the serving infrastructure, right? Run it on 100 machines. Wow, I wrote a search engine. You can search all that. Obviously, when you scale it up to the entire internet, a few more things get involved. But it was just interesting how one day I decided I want to know how Google Maps finds routes from A to B. And there was a code lab, and I spent a few hours just playing with it, writing my own stuff. Really interesting stuff that it's hard to find similar stuff on the internet just because you can't run something on 100 machines, right? That's not, maybe with AWS or Google Cloud now you could, but it's expensive, right? Here, it was just something fun you could do. The next interesting thing were these talks that they had. People, again, like Google as a company, so they would come and give talks. Anyone who wrote a book, the authors would come. Anyone who had written some new language, they'd come and give a talk. Anyone who was updating the way something worked in the compiler or the way a new process, they'd come and give a talk. And these were just open to anyone at Google would come and listen to the talks. They were generally recorded, so you could watch them later. Usually watch them at 2x speed in the background or something. But phenomenal stuff. Hillary Clinton came, Barack Obama came. These were just phenomenal talks all the time. So Google Groups was the sort of the way that you just communicate with other engineers at the company and other people at the company. There was a group called C users, which was for people doing C++ and C programming. And you could just ask questions, and people would jump in. And then you'd go figure out if their name was on one of the books on your shelf. And often it was, and it was phenomenal. I got particularly involved with C++ standards and was involved in adding multi-threading to the C++ standard. And so I started jumping in on some of these threads, like, oh yeah, I know how that works, let me answer this. And then people were like, oh man, you're the guy who proposed that thing. I'm like, okay, I guess maybe imposter syndrome goes away a little now. Now I kind of feel like maybe I should be here. But and then Google+, which I know none of you use because no one uses Google+. Internally, Google+ was the social network for the company, right? I mean, we sort of pushed into it, but once everyone's in it, right, it was great. And so it saddens me now, like Google+ really doesn't work well when none of your friends are on it. And I think it was a great network, and so internally we used it all the time. So the last thing I have down here is the picture here, testing on the toilet. So when you're standing at the urinal, right there, some little tidbit about how you could write tests better, or how you could use the language better, right? This was like, this was literally every week they put up a new little lesson for you to learn, right? Take you a few trips to the bathroom to read the whole thing. That's all right. So it's one of those weird things that it works. You do learn good tricks. Most companies wouldn't do that, though. Okay, so living in the future. So I have to get a. Where did I? All right. So I got some props here. This was my first Android phone, and I got this about 6 months before Android was announced publicly. When they gave it to me, You couldn't put it in your pocket because it generated so much heat, like it would give you a burn. The software was a little new. They're still working on some of the bugs, but yeah, this was a few months after the iPhone came out. Google had some internal stuff that was starting to work. This one actually has all sorts of serial numbers on it, so that if people take pictures of it, they know I let you take pictures of it. So, big trouble for me. This little beauty here, Google Glass. So this, I'll let it boot up. The battery's a little tired on it now, so it only lasts about an hour, so I just had to turn it off while I was waiting. So it's booting up right now, and I can see in here, it projects off here, off a parabolic lens, and then the screen's on this side. And so I can see the boot up screen, but normally you can see, you know, whatever you want to see. Once it boots up, I'm going to take a picture of all of you. So. It takes forever to boot up. I'll take a picture in a second. Other early interesting stuff, Waymo. This was the self-driving car stuff. They were working on that in maybe 2010, and they would come and give talks, and you could learn where they were at. And you know, they were still at the point where there was a guy with a big red button, and he hit it like every block, right? That's how bad the software was, but that's how you learn, right? So, is this working yet? Yeah. I have to type in my password right. There we go. Okay, Glass, take a picture. There we go. I can see all of you on my little screen. So I got this around the time that it was released publicly. This was not actually free, but it was about a 50% discount for Google employees if they wanted to buy it. In Silicon Valley, there was a period of about a year where it was marginally socially acceptable to wear this in public. So I did. It was good. I enjoyed it. It's much better with the sunglass attachment. Put this on. I mean, it's still pretty nerdy. A little better, right? If you put a hat on, then you know it's okay. So I used to wear this around all the time. I really enjoyed it when my third kid was born. You'd be holding her and she'd start doing something cute. And you'd say, "Okay, Glass, take a video." And boom, you're taking a video, right? And so that's, I don't actually want a video, but I have more pictures of my third kid than I do of my first two by an order of magnitude because I had this on my face all the time and could just take pictures. It also has a button if I want to take a picture of them. So, I really enjoyed it. I think once the watches started working well, a lot of what you can do on this, you can do on the watch, right? Like I can do a Google search on this, but I can do that on a watch, be a little less awkward. The best feature of this is the camera looking at what I'm looking at. And so I can take pictures and take videos and stuff. I enjoyed it quite a bit. Turns out, not socially acceptable even in Silicon Valley anymore, so too bad. So the work process at Google was also very futuristic. The teleconferencing equipment there was phenomenal. We'd be sitting at a table like this, and there'd be a big screen at the end, and then there'd be more table in the screen because you're talking to someone in New York, and it just looked like one long table. And there was no latency; it was all high definition. You could join the meeting from your laptop. You could join the meeting from your phone. You can present from your phone, right? I was debating actually trying to just present this on the Chromecast from my phone. Decided it'd probably fail, and then so I got a wire. But this is a Chromebook. I actually mostly use Chromebooks now. Google is a web-based company, right? There's no need to install software anymore. You just go to the web page. If Google needed me to sign a document, well, that document was a web page. And I go to the web page, and I click OK, and that's how everything at the company works. It's all a web page. And so I had a mailbox, and literally the last 4 years I was there, I received nothing in my mailbox. And the last thing I'd received before that was a card from a recruiter because I had taken a last-second interview and done an interview with like 15 minutes notice. So she physically mailed me a card. And it had probably been 2 years before that before I'd received something. It's incredible how paper-free the place actually was. Now, if you're going to be a fast place, you have to have a network that's awesome. And Google has its own backbone that connects all its offices around the world, connects all its data centers. I remember in 2008 when Google Maps was a fairly new product. MapQuest was state of the art at the time, if you remember that. When you went to Google Maps, right, little tiles would pop up, right? If you were on Google's network, boom, they were there. You could go into satellite mode. That came out in 2008, I think. And normally it would take a few seconds for all the tiles to come up. I used to zoom in to random place in the world and just scroll as fast as I could. Right? These tiles would come in faster than you could scroll. It was the most miraculous network. Things like YouTube videos, you could upload a video in a minute, right? Where it might take you an hour at home. So great for a software engineer to have access like that. And then machine learning. When I left, probably the last year I was at Google, machine learning was the big thing. They wanted everyone at the company to learn it. They wanted everyone at the company to use it, figure out what you could do with it to increase whatever it was you were trying to maximize. They are buying specialized hardware now to make it run faster. They have all the world's experts, right? They bought the company DeepMind, the one that does the playing Go and playing chess and all that kind of stuff. And so, again, it's one of those things where you ask a question on the mailing list and someone who you've heard of because they work on this stuff, on a global scale, jumps in, oh yeah, you probably need to change the way you're tuning this, or oh, that's a known problem with the way those parameters work on a bifurcated model like that. You want to try that? Awesome. Free food. All right, so Google had all these cafes. There were probably a small building might have a cafe, a big building would have one, a really big building might have two. These cafes, about half of them were sort of generic, healthy, but still tasty food. And about half of them would have some theme. There'd be a Mexican restaurant or a Chinese restaurant or whatever. Some of them were decidedly unhealthy. The burrito place was delicious. And so every day at lunch, that's where you went. You never went out. Why would you go out and pay for food when there's 7 wonderful restaurants within a block or 2 of your building that have free food? And the result was, compared to other places I've worked, we went out for lunch for like 45 minutes and we were back, instead of getting in the car, driving a mile away, right? Well, sit for an hour. So, it clearly had benefit to the company. They also provide breakfast and dinner, so if you really want to work a long day, they're happy to have you. The other thing they had was every floor of every building had a micro kitchen. And this is something like HustleCo has here, except 1,000 kinds of snacks and hundreds of flavors of drinks, and just unreal, right? I got a bit of a jelly bean habit where it's 2 in the afternoon, time to go get a cup of jelly beans, right? not a habit I should have, but they also had a gym in almost every building, so that useful things. But and they also had coffee bars all over, so people would in the afternoon, wander off. Every second building or whatever would have a coffee bar, and they'd have a barista who'd make you a coffee. Right? Obviously, the micro kitchens had machines that could make you a coffee, but you want that experience to go into a coffee bar, having a barista, sure. And then most teams would also have their own drinks of the alcoholic variety, right? I had a keg in my office most of my years at Google. In fact, I was responsible for maintaining it because I drank the most from it. Cheers. I feel sorry for, I think who got it? I think Eric got it now. So now Eric has to learn how to maintain the keg since I left. But the thing I really like about having a keg is, like, one time I was working on debugging this horrible problem, and I'd been working on it for like 2 days, and I finally figured out exactly what stupid combination things had happened. And it was Tuesday at like 10:30 in the morning. Like, well, I need a beer. So with a keg, you can pour a half a beer, right? And pour everyone a half a beer. Clink, yay, we found the bug, right? But it's not the same as cracking open a whole beer and being drunk by lunch. So I like having kegs. So let's talk about Google Scale. Again, I'm not going to tell you how many machines they have, but It's more than you think. At Google's scale, if I could save them 1% CPU, they'd give me a team of people and a year to do it, right? That's the kind of scale we're talking about. I worked on storage a lot. So Google stores a lot of bytes. And if I could make storing bytes 1% cheaper, I had a job, right? They also care a lot about latency. They do experiments and they can show that if Google search is 5 milliseconds faster, people come back 3% more often to issue searches. If they come back 3% more often, they click on 3% more ads, and yes, here's a team, save 5 milliseconds, that would be great. Google scale is also frightening when you are doing initial launch of a product, because inevitably it ends up on the front page of New York Times and everything, and everyone swarms to your product. So the initial launch for some of these products was 10,000, even 100,000 customers would sign up on the launch day for some of these products. So the way that they dealt with this was they would dog food internally. Dog food is an old Microsoft saying, like if you're running a dog food factory and you haven't tasted your own dog food, do you know what you're doing, right? So you have to taste your own dog food. And in software now, the term dog food has come to mean you have to run your own software. If you think you're going to be launching this next week, you better be using it and enjoying it, because that's how you know it's any good. So everything that Google does, right, that huge list I had a few slides back, they were dog fooding all the time. Your phone would have, they had a dog food manager that ran on your phone that would push new updates to all these apps every week. So it was awesome when Google Maps launched some new thing, and you're like, oh, wow, something new. Of course, when they launched something terrible and it crashed your phone every 5 minutes, that kind of sucked, but that's why you eat your own dog food, you know if it's working or not. Another interesting thing for anyone who writes software here is at scale, machines break all the time. If a machine has a 1 in 1,000 chance of breaking in a day, and you're running on 1,000 machines, you're going to have a machine break every day. So when we wrote software, we couldn't say, oh, a machine broke, go get someone to go fix the machine. No, right? When a machine breaks, you queue it up and say, we'll fix that sometime when there happens to be a guy in that aisle, right? And literally guys would have a list to go, okay, today you're going to go through the data center and you're going to fix this hard drive and this network card, and right? It's a lot more efficient to just go and fix the whole aisle at once. But that meant that the software has to be resilient. The software has to assume that anything could break. And in practice, that's what you want your software to do. You never want to assume that hard drive will never lose my data, right? Hard drives die. You're going to be sad when it loses your data. You never want to assume, oh, this software will never corrupt anything. Software corrupts stuff, so, right? So everyone at Google writes software that doesn't trust anything, right? And you have to, but that's what gives you reliability at the end of the day, is you've written this code that even when totally unexpected things happen, you didn't trust any of this stuff anyway, so it recovers. And then at the end of the day, someone usually has to go and fix it up in the background. There's a job there called Site Reliability Engineer, the SREs, and they literally wrote the book on reliability engineering. This is, again, one of those books. They actually wrote it while they were at Google. This was the main team. But they have been pushing this new version of software. It's very popular now in large companies, Silicon Valley and stuff, that you don't trust anything. The software should automatically recover from everything, and it should just sort of alert, hey, I've recovered from this, you should go fix the underlying problem when you get around to it, right? And it allows software to be way more dependable. So the last thing we had was access to thousands of machines for testing. When I worked on the search infrastructure team, we literally brought up a whole cluster of search, which meant a whole slew of index machines. I think there were over 1,000, and then serving machines and front-end machines. And this was part of our weekly test. We released the software every week, and obviously before you release it, you want to test it at scale and see that it works, and see that when you pass millions of queries into it, that it doesn't fall over. And the only way to do that is to have thousands of machines. And obviously that's a fairly unique thing. Most companies do not have thousands of machines that they just, oh yeah, need to test something, sure, we got that. A lot of teams would use those machines at night, right? The search team used them during the day to do their testing. And at night, anyone who needed 1,000 machines to do something, sure, right? Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about Google here is my favorite thing at Google was TGIF. Thank goodness it's Friday, which they now have on Thursdays. Turns out with time changes and stuff, people from Asia don't want to show up Saturday morning to watch your Friday night thing, but they might show up Friday morning to watch your Thursday night thing. So, but this was a weekly all-hands meeting. Literally everyone in the company was invited. They were broadcasting it in conference rooms all around the world, and Larry and Sergey and some of the other execs would go up and they'd talk about what they'd launched that week, interesting news about the company. Of course, there was beer, there were appetizers, good time. Occasionally there'd be, t-shirts and hats and stuff like that. I literally had a suitcase branded with Google, and I don't think I could fit all the Google branded stuff I have in that suitcase. So, pretty good. But that was the first half of the meeting. And the really, really important part was the second half of the meeting, where they would literally take live questions from the audience, and they had a program called Google Moderator, where people could type in questions and vote on questions they wanted to see answered, and the good questions would trickle up, and they'd take questions off of that too. And so this meant whenever something at Google was doing something maybe a little questionable, right? Maybe there's a little privacy concern, or where it would bubble up to the top, and you would literally that Thursday see the execs up on stage trying to answer why they'd done this, or what they were going to do about it, or what needed to change. And this made sure that a lot of big problems couldn't fester, right? We've all seen in the news, oh, Google had a disaster about this or that or something else. I assure you, there was 10 times as much talk about it inside the company, right? And because of this, I can tell you, Google is actually respecting your data. If someone wanted to write a program that did something terrible with your data, someone would say, hey, that's not right, and they'd announce it to the engineers. And then the engineers would get up in arms, they'd bring their pitchforks to TGIF. and there would be 5 execs up on stage trying to answer why they were letting this product be launched. It was unfortunate for little teams, maybe 3 guys have an idea, the idea gets sort of twisted, it's not exactly their idea, and then the engineers take off, and then those 3 guys up on stage going, we've been working on this for a week, sorry. But it did prevent a lot of real privacy problems, security problems, that sort of stuff. I honestly believe, from being inside Google, you can trust your data there because of this feedback loop. No one can do nefarious things with your data because the engineers care, and the engineers have a way to enforce that. So, all right. So that brings me to the second half of the talk. Calgary versus Silicon Valley. Why am I here? Why did I leave? So first of all, I only want to live in a world-class city, right? I don't want to live in Red Deer. I was born in Red Deer, but I don't want to go back. So there's not a lot of cities in the world that sort of have what I want, a wealth of activities, a place where you can see all the shows, a place where when you travel, people know where you're from, a place where there's real universities, where you're going to run into people. One of my friends got a job at Stanford while I was there, right? That's not going to happen in Red Deer, right? But there's a difference between, San Francisco is a very important place. Obviously a lot of incredible stuff happens there. Big companies that change the world. It's important. Calgary's really nice. It feels nicer. People are friendlier. There's the government functions. You can afford housing, right? People in Silicon Valley have a different attitude on life, and everyone's poor because of housing costs. Housing costs in Silicon Valley are insane. They were really bad 6 years ago when I bought a house. And then I sold the house for almost twice as much money when I left, right? The prices have doubled every every 7 or 8 years for like 20 years. And they're completely unsustainable now. And no new housing is getting built. The way the governments work there, there's a bunch of little cities, and each little city is told, you need to build 1,000 new houses this year. And then the city builds 30 new houses. But they add 1,000 new jobs, right? And every city does this, and they all expect that some other city will build the housing, and so no one does. And so housing prices just keep going up. So my example here for a house you could buy, a 1,500 square foot house is $1.3 million US. That's in a bad school district, and by bad I mean you would not send your kids to that school, so you'd send them to private school for another 10 or 15,000. Remember, I have 5 kids, so I paid the 20% premium and got a nice school district, but that was an option. And this is not in a nice neighborhood. This is not Palo Alto. This is not San Francisco. You pay double again if you want to live like in a really nice place. I compared that to Calgary. A 1,530 square foot place is going to be about 425,000. Right? That's a 4x difference when you take the currency exchange in. And the Calgary house is probably going to be newer. It's probably going to be nicer. There's going to be a park nearby that the city maintains. And the school will be okay, and there's probably a library. Those sorts of things. There's a website called Burbed, which is if you ever want like some Schadenfreude on like how bad it can get. This is the best example they had. This is a 1,988 square foot house, so not big, but all right. Built in 1963. You can see from the outside it's okay, right? This house got over 20 bids and sold for $2.47 million US dollars. This is not in a great location. The elementary school's good, the high school's okay. You're probably still a 20, 25-minute commute to Google or Apple or, So yes, you make a lot of money, and then you pour it all in. So let's talk about money. Again, I'm not going to tell you how much money I made, but I have sort of some example numbers here. One important thing in Silicon Valley is the money you make is not just your salary. You get some base salary, but almost every company there has a bonus, has stock options, stock grants, 401k, that's your retirement matching, and health insurance, which is a big deal, right? Like on my compensation statement, and we spent $20,000 on health insurance for you, so you should feel good, right? As a Canadian. Okay? Now health insurance is really, the health insurance I had there was really great. And if you have great health insurance, the American health system is wonderful. It's horrifyingly expensive, but it's wonderful, right? But a lot of people don't have good health insurance, and then it's terrible. So, sort of an estimate of what someone who started at Google straight out of college might make, something like $100,000. And they could probably expect about half that much again in other benefits and stuff. But stock is one of those things that sometimes you make a lot of money, sometimes you make no money. Stock options in particular are something where if your company doesn't do well, your stock options are worth 0, right? So that was some big part of your compensation, and the company didn't do well, so sorry, nothing. If the company does okay, you might make tens of thousands. If the company does great, you might make hundreds of thousands. If the company turns out to be Google or Facebook, sure, you could make millions, but most companies you're going to start at are probably going to go out, and you're not going to make anything. So this feeds back into the housing market, where, 1% of people have made millions of dollars on their stock, so sure, they'll spend $3 or $4 million on a house, no problem, right? But this kind of income can't buy $1.5 million house. You have to save up your 20%, right? That's $300,000. Right? And you're paying $40,000, $50,000 a year in rent. So everyone I know in Silicon Valley right now is living in terrible little houses, and they are hungry because they can't afford to buy things because they spend all of their money on rent. It's I'm talking about my poor friends who worked at other companies that didn't have free rent. Although a lot of big companies have started doing that now, particularly lunch. So there is, though, a lot of companies that compete for top talent. And if you have a particular skill that's in demand, companies will ask you every week, hey, come on down. You know, we know you're sitting on a bunch of stock options right now that are worth money if they ever vest, but we'll just give you cash right now, or we'll give you, you know, some big chunk of the company if you come and join us. So some people do get to move, get the big bonuses. So in Calgary, I sort of my guess at what the same person would make is maybe 70,000. You know, maybe 10% in bonuses and stock and stuff. So that's 2x, 2.5x kind of difference. But at the end of the day, $70,000 in Calgary, you can afford to buy a house, right? 100,000 in California, you'll never buy a house. So, but it is a little troubling if you have very specialized skills, because it's not clear that there's a lot of people in Calgary who want that skill, and so you can't shop your skill around to a bunch of other companies. So that's one of the problems I'm suffering from these days. So taxes. People always say, oh, Canada's taxes are so high, right? This is sort of a guess, you know, if you're making a reasonable software engineer salary, what you might pay in taxes. The income taxes are a little bit higher in Calgary, not a ton higher. Property taxes are a lot higher in California, and your house costs 4 times more. So you pay, you know, 8 times as much in property taxes. The sales tax is a lot higher in California. The gas tax is actually pretty similar between California and Alberta. And then the sales tax, or sorry, the income tax I'm quoting there is the alternative minimum tax, which is a horribly complicated income tax thing where you fill out your taxes twice and pay whichever one's higher. If you make somewhere between about 150 and about 800,000 US, you almost certainly pay the AMT, which means you don't get to take deductions. I have 5 kids. I don't get to deduct anything from them. It's a weird thing, but I don't know. So like that income tax in Calgary, I'm going to get to deduct my 5 kids, right? So at the end of the day, I think it's kind of a wash. Certainly you don't pay a lot more in taxes here, and you get health insurance here, right? Whereas if you pay for health insurance in the States, first you had to pay taxes on the money that you then spent. So that brings me to governance. The governance in the US is totally screwed up these days. California has, as I said, moderately high taxes, and they don't do anything with it. There's no new roads being built right now. Like literally, they're adding 5% new jobs every year. There's no new roads being built. They have some plans, like, yeah, we'd like to add a lane there if we ever get some money, you know, maybe 5, 10, 15 years, we'll see. It's terrifying. They literally can't pave some of the roads they have. They have big potholes in them, and you can look at it from a what's the most economic time to pave a road point of view. Turns out, you know, once it's like 70% of its useful life, you should pave it, and that's the cheapest time to pave it. If you let the road go to hell, it costs so much more to bring it back up, it's more expensive. To which they say, well, we don't have the money to do it now, so we'll do it later. And they let the road literally get like torn up potholes, practically gravel, before they pay the big money to recover it. Makes no sense. The transit system in Silicon Valley is atrocious. And they spend more money per rider than any other transit system in North America. But if I wanted to take the train, or the bus or whatever to Google, my commute was about 45 minutes during rush hour, you know, maybe 25 minutes without rush hour. The bus was going to take me almost 2 hours with 2 transfers, right? It's, you know, people in Calgary don't want to hear that the transit here is awesome, but if you're going downtown, if you're not going downtown, Calgary's transit is terrible, but right, if you're going downtown, the transit here is great. The trains will take you, the high-speed buses will take you, all that. In California, the traffic is terrible everywhere. The transit doesn't go the directions people want to go. It has gotten bad enough that companies actually run their own private transit systems. I think, yeah. See that big bus? That's a Google bus. Google runs hundreds of buses a day, mostly from San Francisco, but from all around the Bay Area. The buses are really nice inside. They have leather seats, Wi-Fi, power for your computer, so you can get some work done while you're sitting on the bus. If you're coming from San Francisco, it's about a 40-mile commute, and it would take at least 90 minutes, if not 2 hours, so each way. So if you were driving that, that was 3 or 4 hours of your day. So people would take the bus, and doing public transit would still be 3 or 4 hours. So everyone took the bus. Okay, so back to governance here. The federal government, Trump. It's pretty terrible. They have a hard time, currently they're having a new budget showdown every 3 weeks or whatever. This is crazy. And then they have this debt showdown, which is a different thing. So first they approve the budget, and then they approve to borrow the money to pay for the budget that they approved. And every time one of these comes up, they're like, well, let's defund Planned Parenthood. And the other side says, well, no, we don't want to do that. I say, well, fine, then we'll shut down the government. What? It's ridiculous. And then the regulatory capture, if you've been following the net neutrality debate, Ajit Pai has turned around net neutrality. So now Comcast could say, if you want to go to Facebook and you don't want it to be horrifyingly slow, pay me an extra $5. And the rules had already passed to prevent that, and then they just reversed them because they could. This sort of thing just doesn't happen as much in Canada, and it's ironic because the government is arguably more powerful here. If you have a majority, you just make up laws and vote for them, and they're laws now, done. In practice, though, the bureaucrats in Canada actually have a lot of power, and they're not going to push for laws that don't utterly make sense, right? In the U.S., everything comes down to these very partisan congressional and senators, and they decide where huge amounts of money go. One of the reasons that the roads are so bad is that to build a new road, you need a lot of money. All the money's in the federal government, so the federal government will say, this year you can build a new road if it has a carpool lane. So then every city figures out, well, we need a new road from here to here, let's add a carpool lane. And then, right? Or, oh, this year, light rail, yeah, you need money for light rail. So everyone changes their bus route into a train route now, right? And that's how you get money to apply for it. It's the reverse of this is what we need, can we have the money to build it? It's, this is what you can build, figure out how to need this. Yeah, it's a little weird. All right. One of the last things I really want to complain about is the immigration system in the US. So the H-1B, which is the way that most software engineers who wanted to work in the US would come in on. Every year the system resets on November 1st. And on that day, they get about 50% more applications than they're allowed to give out visas for the entire year. It used to be take most of the year. But now, literally on November 1st, they will receive, I think it's 100,000 or 120,000 applications for 70,000 visas. They hold a lottery. If you win the lottery, great, you'll get a visa in March or something. It takes them a while to process it all. If you don't, better luck next year. So imagine you're trying to hire someone on November 2nd, right? Say, well, we'll wait a year, then we'll apply. And if you win the lottery, we'll see you the March after that. And if you don't win the lottery, well, we'll wait another year, right? So in practice, the H-1B is not what a lot of companies use now. They use something called L1, which is an intra-company transfer. And so they all have offices in Vancouver. This is what Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, they all have a Vancouver office. And they just park people there for 1 year. Once you've worked at a company for a year, you can transfer into the US on an L1 visa. So these people are asked, say you're from India, you've got a degree, yeah, we want you to come work with us, but we're going to have you move to Vancouver first for a year. You know, and your manager's not in Vancouver, your manager's in Seattle, your manager's in Silicon Valley. So, you know, you're kind of part of the team, but you know, you're in Vancouver. So work for a year. You know, don't get connected to the community or anything because we're going to rip you out of there. But you know, enjoy it for the year you're there, and then we'll move you down, and then you can start your career, you can start your life. Right? As an added bonus, on an H1 or an L1, your spouse and your kids don't get a work permit.
On an L they do. An L.
It depends on which L.
I was in L2.
Okay, some L2s now do. Some
That was
L2s
10
don't.
years ago, so maybe it's changed.
Yeah, it changes. That's the other thing is this whole process takes years, and then they change the rules underneath you. So who the hell knows? Now Canadians and Mexicans do have the option of going down on a TN status, which means you show up at the border and say I'm an engineer, and they need an engineer. You get in. So that helps. But a TN is technically a temporary work permit. And when you're on a temporary work permit, that means you have to keep reapplying, although I know people have reapplied for 20 years and keep getting it, but you're not going to be able to get a mortgage because the bank says, well, you're not living here, so you know, we can't give you a mortgage. You know, some banks won't let you open bank accounts, and you can't apply for a green card because green cards are for people who are aiming to be there permanently. The green card process takes about 2 to 20 years, depending on your education level and what country you're from. If you have a master's degree and you're not from India or China, then it's usually more in the 2 to 3 year range. I did not have a master's, so we got our green card after I've been working at Google about 7 years. During that time you're doing your green card, you must stay at your company. Your company is sponsoring you for your green card. So some of these Indian guys are stuck at a company for 20 years, whether they're enjoying it or not, right? They've been there 18 years and the company starts saying, oh, well, we don't want to pay you this year. Well, you want to stick around and finish your green card or not, right? Obviously, Google was not the type of company to take advantage of that, but there were companies that would bring guys over from India, get them 2/3 of the way through the green card process, and then start cutting their salary or cutting their wages. And I mean, what are you supposed to do at that point, right? It's brutal. There's also, of course, the amount of paperwork is mind-boggling, especially as a Googler who had no paperwork, right? You fill out a new form every few months to apply for this or that or change the status or whatever. And sometimes while you were waiting for your application to be processed, which of course takes months because this is the US government, you couldn't travel internationally. If you left the country, you were deemed to have abandoned your application, and the whole green card process got thrown away. So some of that actually adds to the time. You'd be like, well, I don't want to apply for my green card. I don't want to apply for the next stage in November because I want to be able to go home for Christmas. So we'll apply in January. But U.S. immigration system is dehumanizing. It is atrocious for everyone involved, and I'm very happy to not be doing it anymore. So the last thing I want to talk about is the weather. California has much better weather. There's no two ways around that. But California has a big problem with global warming. The droughts are getting droughtier, and it gets pretty hot in the summer, and it's getting hotter now in the summer, and they're getting less rain in the winter. Calgary is in a wonderful spot for global warming. Right? Not that I want to go global warming, but you know, if you believe that, say, the U.S. is never going to get their shit together and actually deal with this problem, and global warming is going to happen, you know, I think Calgary is a great spot. They're actually, the predictions I've seen are we'll get a little more rain. It'll all come in June, but still, we'll have some more water. We can afford to grow. The winters will get a little less bad. We'll have a few more hot days in the summer. Not so bad. But Calgary's weather is actually a problem. If you're trying to hire someone from like India or China or someone, some of these people have never seen snow. And it terrifies them. Right? Like they just won't consider, you know, it'd be like if you said, oh, you want to get a job in this country where you don't speak the language at all. Right? You just write it off. No, I'm not going to a country where I don't speak the language. And some of these people, they've never seen snow. the idea, oh, yeah, you have to shovel your driveway, you know, once a week or whatever in the winter. Nope, 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 nope. So that's a challenge that Calgary has, right? It is a winter city, and there's not a lot of easy solutions for that, but we'll see. Maybe global warming will get really bad in the winter. All right, so that brings me to the most important slide in the entire talk, which is, what am I doing now? And the answer is, I'm not doing anything right now. But I would like to be doing something. So I'm actually open for a lot of possibilities. Like I said, I have 5 kids at home, and I've been enjoying spending time with them. So I'm not super excited to go back to a 9-to-5 grind and all that. But contract work, part-time work, maybe some full-time work if there's some flexibility in the schedule. I'm up to, if you need a contractor to come in, review your code, look at your culture, you know, whatever. I'd be happy to do something like that. If you just want to chat about stuff, let me know. Things that I'm looking for in a job, interesting technology. You know, I've worked on some phenomenally interesting stuff, and if what you want is to input stuff into a database, whatever. I want good culture. I'm never going back to a company that needs me to show up at 9:01 every morning, and you know, like that's not going to happen. I am looking for a fairly senior role. You know, if you're hiring a brand new developer, that's probably not me. And I want to have a big impact. But if any of you hear of anything or know of anything, I'm at Birkin on Twitter, or there's my email address. The other possibility is I may start a company. That's something that you can do in Calgary. Ironically, people think of startups as a Silicon Valley thing, but when you are living in a house where the rent is $4,000 or $5,000 a month, you have to pay your health insurance, which for my family was going to be tens of thousands of dollars a year, and you're trying to hire people who expect 6-figure salaries and expect that you're going to pay for their health insurance too. It's terrifying, right? In Calgary, everything's orders of magnitude cheaper, right? I don't have to pay anyone's health insurance. Salaries are half as much. So I'm actually considering seriously that I might just spend a few months, try and start something, try and hire some folks, see what I can get done. So that's exciting to me. Although if the right opportunity came along that met all the rest of that list, I would be happy to get along that too. So that brings me to my last slide. I have lots of stories to tell, and I'd love to tell them all, but I don't want everyone to have to sit in their chairs any longer. So what I want you to do is I'll stand up, talk to each other, and then if you want to ask any questions about these stories, we can talk about them later. Happy to talk with everyone. And once again, I want to thank the HustleCo guys. This is a great space. Thanks for all you did to set this up. Thank you. I was usually working, I don't know, once I had kids, I went to work after I dropped them off at school. There's no buses in California because the government doesn't provide services. So. But I was getting into work about 9:30 or 10, but certainly people showed up at 10:30 or 11 or, it depended on the team. The team was older parent types, yeah, then they would tend to show up, reasonable times in the morning and go home reasonable times at night, but
So it's flexible.
it was very, very flexible.
And did you have like 15-hour days?
I honestly worked, 8 or 9 hours a day. Nothing ridiculous. I actually found that I worked so hard that at the end of the day, like sitting at my desk staring at a computer was not useful anymore. And so, it's time to go home.
I had a question. I was just reading about the lawsuit against Google today, and I just want to get your kind of thoughts on, one, was it a really politically charged environment? Like, was there a lot of discussion of politics? And was it very politically one-sided?
Google is a very pro-science place. And in the US, there is a political party that is very anti-science. And that makes it difficult for people who might be, pro-business, pro-low taxes, some of the other nominally Republican things. Yeah, but they're like climate denier racist Nazis who want to nuke North Korea. Like, And so there are definitely very few openly Republican people at Google. In terms of that particular lawsuit, it's tough. Like the things that he said, if you read them from a very literal scientific point of view, everything he wrote is true. If you look at the way he said it, it's horrifying. He's really demeaning and attacking people. And Google's facing a lot of criticism for having very few females and very few minorities and that kind of thing. So they obviously have an interest in being inclusive. And when someone is putting down all women as being inferior, yeah. So I understand why that happened, but there's also a lot of semi-autistic folks at Google who do read these things very literally, and they're looking at, well, yes, if you look at the data, right, women have this versus men, and and some of his logic around how biology, it's all true, but he said really mean things while explaining it, and so it's a tough call, but it's a sort of debate that happens all the time at Google where you get,
So it is like a lot of politics being talked.
There was a mailing group called Politics, and if you signed up for that and contributed to that, you knew what you were getting in for. The few Republicans who spoke up in that list were routinely attacked fairly often. And generally speaking, they weren't trying to, promote racism or promote climate denial or those sorts of things. But I'm sure it was tough for those folks. But the existence of that list meant that if some other mail thread started picking up political bent, people would go, yeah, take it to politics. Right? And so the vast majority of the time, no, we weren't talking politics, right? Unless we were talking net neutrality or something, right? But that sort of impacted the company in a meaningful way. So.
Google's going via AI. Is anybody looking at inside Google, looking at how AI is being used by existing power structures?
I mean, there's tons of people working on AI now. There's multiple separate teams. I'm sure there's people looking at just about everything. I can't say I know of anything in particular, but I think the sort of feel internally was AI has a huge potential to optimize things that in the past we've sort of, this is kind of good enough because we don't really have the time to deal with it, right? Like one thing they had was really interesting was the cooling system in the data centers, right? Oh, it's going to be this hot outside, so we better turn up the AC a little, or and some guy would make that decision every hour and he'd go turn the knob. Well, an AI can read 100 different weather variables and know what the load coming in the machines is and all this kind of stuff, do an amazing prediction and turn the knob 500 times a second. Right? And they ended up improving the cooling costs by 10% or something by turning on this AI. So little problems like that where the problem is more to like optimize it. We kind of know the idea, but really optimizing it is really hard. AIs are great at that. AIs are not good at coming up with new ideas. They're not good at understanding subtleties about the problem. And so a lot of people, I think, sort of a public view of, AI is going to take over the world. Internally, we didn't really feel like that was the case. The neural networks and deep learning and stuff were really good at optimizing really known problems. And they're really terrible at just about anything else to try to apply them to. So, I don't know, that's sort of the opinion I saw.
Not an AI or an expert system? Not an AI, true AI, or was it an expert system?
Define those terms, right? Like, that was what a lot of people at Google did not enjoy terms, right? Do people at Google use Agile? Do they use Scrum? Do they use pair programming? Well, we do what needs to be done, right? If it's good to work with someone else, but I'm not going to say I only pair program and follow these 7 rules. Like, so, around AI, the terminology is changing every month, and I don't think people were really that interested in let me apply labels to these. And, far more interesting to say people have applied these two labels, but there's kind of an overlap. What happens when I don't think of it in terms of two things and think of it as one thing? And, it's an interesting idea.
What's your impression of tech scene here in Calgary?
There's a lot more going on here than the last time I looked for a job here, which was admittedly like 13 years ago. I feel like the startup scene, little companies is very exciting. There's a lot of little companies. There's not a lot of mature startups, right? The companies that are at 50 or 100 or 200 people, that really doesn't exist. It's unfortunate for me. My expertise is how to take your thing that runs on 100 machines and make it run on 1,000 machines or 10,000 machines. And there's no companies in Calgary that are at that level. It'll come for sure. If Amazon comes here, it's going to rip the scene to pieces. We'll see. I know from looking at New York, when Google moved into New York, initially it totally destroyed the startup scene, but long term it helped quite a bit because as a software engineer, you could move to New York to join a startup and know if the startup fails or you hate it or whatever, there's real software jobs available, right? Like Google, like Facebook came in, and then, right? Today in Calgary, if I was from India and I'm looking, okay, where am I I want to move to North America, I want to take a job. If you move to Calgary, even if the job's great, if the company fails or you don't like your manager or anything about it, now you have to find another job in Calgary that uses the same skills, that'll pay the same amount. And it's a much smaller scene, and it's a much less mature scene, so it's challenging. Yeah?
Ultimately, what factor motivated you to leave Google? What was your...
Mostly it was housing costs. Our plan was to have 4 kids, and we got twins at the end. So our plan, the way that you survive in Silicon Valley is to have the smallest house you can possibly survive in, right? Because the housing costs dominate everything else, right? You can go on expensive trips, have a fancy car, buy all sorts of electronics, as long as you don't have an extra bedroom on your house, because that would cost more than all of your toys.
How did you know it was time?
Well, so we were looking at a new house, right? We had a $2 million house that was not big enough. We need a $3 million house. And of course, my family's in Calgary, and so, what could we get in Calgary for that kind of money? Ooh. So, I'm from a career growth point of view, I've been at Google 10 years. Being at there 15 or 20 years doesn't make a huge difference on my resume. I want to try something different. My kids are at the right age now to move. They're all under 10, which once you got teenagers, that gets tough. So, those are my personal reasons for moving back. If Google had an office in Calgary, I would almost certainly still be working at Google. Right? It wasn't that I didn't
a lot
like
of
the
people
job.
from the Bay Area would come up here in a heartbeat.
There's a
Pick
mailing
Google
list.
or
There's a
Amazon,
mailing list
and
internally,
nobody had one.
Vancouver,
Yeah.
and there were hundreds of people on that list who were trying to get a Vancouver office, right?
But people don't appreciate that Vancouver is just as bad.
Vancouver, well, it's
Almost.
the housing cost is still pretty terrible, but a lot of the other aspects of Vancouver are much better, right?
But if you were talking about how good the virtual meetings were,
Mhm.
like desktop and television.
Absolutely.
So why do they still have such emphasis on physical location?
I mean, some of it's, I think, just sort of a momentum thing. 5 years ago, the virtual workspace was not as good, right? The guy would call in, you get a low-res little fuzzy version of him that was delayed half a second, and right, it wasn't as good. Now Google's at the point where they have probably 60 or 70 buildings in Silicon Valley, right? Some of those buildings are miles apart. So yes, we're on the same campus, but if we need to talk to each other, we're gonna have a virtual meeting, because a virtual meeting is almost as good, and it saves one of us having to travel halfway across town. And that really only happened in the last maybe 5 years. And it's hard for a company who has said all along, no, everyone needs to be on site, we need the serendipitous meetings, and those are some of the excuses for why they have the cafes and stuff, right? Everyone has lunch together, so you just kind of run into people. You have the micro kitchen, so you meet all the people on your floor. There's value in that. I'm sure there's value in that. But now, I used to work on teams that were all located centrally, and then over the last few years, half the team was in New York, or half the team was in Seattle, and so now, every meeting that I had, like literally every meeting I had with more than 5 people in it, someone was remote. And at that point, do you need to be in an office? I don't know. Google still thinks you do. You know, I know some people who kind of work remote for Google, but it's hard. And at the end of the day, I decided it wasn't worth trying to fight for a position like that. I'll do something else. All right.
What do you think needs to happen to make the tech sector in Calgary grow?
Price of oil needs to stay low. You know, I've seen in the past when the price of oil is low, everyone's an entrepreneur, and then, you know, oh, we'll pay $100,000 to push bytes around an Excel spreadsheet. You know, well, it's really hard to hire software engineers when they can get bigger salaries to do stupid jobs. So,
have you paid attention to cryptocurrency and smart contracting and mining and all that stuff? Because that is getting more and more massive in terms of computer and all that stuff, smart wallets and all that. Like companies like Binance are being created here for Canadians, new startups.
I think cryptocurrency is going through a bit of a craze right now. I actually sold about half my cryptocurrency last week, so still have a lot, but a lot of the value around cryptocurrency and stuff is decentralization, right? Where you don't need to trust one guy to sort of broker a deal between the two guys. That's the opposite of Google. Google has very little interest in decentralization because they're the center, right? They would much rather you give Google money and they give him money, right? And so obviously a lot of people who worked at Google were interested, and a lot of people tried to propose things that they wanted to work, and usually the company's like, yeah, that doesn't really sound like we'll ever make money at it, and you know, why don't you try and save 1% on our CPU cost or something, right?
So I'm actually moving to Silicon Valley this year. So
good luck.
Advice.
Like I said, get the smallest house you think you can reasonably live in. I knew lots of guys who drove super fancy sports cars and lived in crappy little apartments. But the amount of money they saved on the apartment more than paid for their fancy sports car. So, you know, it's weird how bad houses are there, right? You think, oh, I'm a fancy software engineer, I should have a nice house. And most fancy software engineers have really bad houses. You know, like no air conditioning, no dishwasher, no washer and dryer. I knew software engineers who shared houses that did not have those things, right? But the amount of money they saved doing that paid for their, you know, many vacations around the world in their fancy car, and they bought every electronic device that came out. So you can make it happen. If you have 5 kids, really hard to live in a small house. So.
Follow-up question. Do the parking spots have RV hookups?
There was a particular parking lot that Google owns that they call it their long-term parking lot. And if you were taking a business trip to, say, Australia for 6 months, right? You could sell your house or stop renting your apartment, leave your car in the long-term parking lot, and then move to Australia for 6 months. Right? That was sort of the idea behind it. In practice, this lot did sort of accumulate RVs and stuff. There's been some backlash. There's a lot of news articles that come out, and obviously you can save a lot of money though, right? Google has all the food you need. They have showers, the exercise equipment, play pool till midnight, have fun, right?
They have doctors on campus, right?
They actually do have some doctors on the bigger campuses now. Why go home? Why even have them?
I wonder, when you say the costs are so expensive, when you think of California, you think of obviously urban sprawl.
Yeah.
There's why aren't developers just jumping on buying a plot of land and putting a 70-story skyscraper on it and making people live in matchbox apartments and
Well, if you want to hear me scribe about U.S. zoning regulations. The big culprit in California is CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Assurance, or something like that. Basically, if any development has any impact in any way, shape, or form on something you own, you can sue them. So if someone wants to add a room to their house so that they can have someone rent that room, well, that'll be an extra car that drives in front of my house every day. Right? And I mean, the courts then go, okay, well, that's reasonable, but literally it takes months for it to get through some of this. There was a bowling alley about 2 miles from my house, an old bowling alley that shut down. They wanted to put up a 7-story apartment building, 1,000 units or whatever, and the neighbors complained, started suing. It's like, they'll make it 6 stories, okay, they'll make it 5 stories, and then they said, fuck it, and they walked away. And another developer bought it about a year later, and they're starting the process now, but literally takes years and years and years to get through some of these lawsuits, and there's no guarantee it's going to work in the end. So each town is sort of beholden to the people who live in the town, and the people who live in the town already have a house, so they don't really care that there's no housing available. The people who are commuting 2 hours from the deep suburbs, they care, and they don't get to vote. And they're certainly at the regional level and at the state level, people know this is a problem, and they tell the cities, you have to build more housing. The city says, yeah, we'll definitely think about that. Right? It turns out housing is expensive because you have to provide services to people who live in a city, whereas workers just come and buy lunch and pay taxes and then go home. So jobs are very profitable for cities and houses are not, so no one builds houses.
I'm just curious, obviously you haven't been back in Calgary for a super long time, but do you see the corporate culture, because obviously they're very different corporate cultures, the fluffy tech scene versus, oil, like a city formed from oil corporations, right?
Yeah.
And so how do you see that we need to actually change some more overarching structures, or is it okay?
I think one of the most interesting things, I haven't had a job here, so I haven't talked to any real companies, but when I've talked to startups here, one of the interesting differences is here, if I have a little startup that sells widgets, my first goal is to be the #1 widget supplier in Calgary, and then I'm going to expand to Edmonton, and maybe next year I'll go to Vancouver, right? In Silicon Valley, today I'm selling in the US and tomorrow I'm selling in the world, right? And I mean, it's not realistic that they'll be selling in the world, but that's the goal. That's always the goal. The goal is never, let's expand to Edmonton soon, right? It's always, we are going to be the #1 supplier in the world for widgets. And it drives a lot of the culture, right, to think differently, to think bigger. And it encourages you to not play it safe, right? You might say, okay, well, we've expanded all of Calgary, we're the #1 supplier, we're making money, right? We're done being a startup, we've made money. But to expand Edmonton is going to cost money. Ooh, right? Do we really want to dip back into the red for that, or do we just want to be happy where we are? Silicon Valley, you'd have never hit profitability. If you actually started making money, you'd have expanded faster, right? You look at a company like Uber, they have burned billions of dollars. They are in every major city in the world in a few years. And that's something, and I have not seen a company in Calgary with a culture that could expand to the world in a few years.
Yeah, and I think, I've got a few friends who work remote to the States from Calgary, and I think part of it might be, sorry, this is maybe not, I don't know, but we have a lot of small business grants here. We have a lot of great stuff. We've got research and development grants, whereas in the States it's you do or die, whereas we can live off of grants, we can coast. I think it's it's a coastable environment. We're comfy.
Well, in the US you get the venture capitalists, right?
Yeah. Well, and they push you.
Well, the venture capitalists push you to grow, but it's very easy to get money for an idea. I have a friend who started, he was working on an open source project, and they were like, maybe we could sell this to companies, let's start it as a business. and he got $1.3 million in seed funding. Literally, if you show me his bank account for his company, right? He had single signing authority on $1.3 million in his bank. And his idea failed miserably at the end, right? Like, it's not a success story, but it's very, very easy to get money if you intend to grow 5x, 10x, 100x, right? I think in Calgary you won't find investors who are like, I'll take a 10% chance you'll grow 100x, right? Which is a great investment if you can make 30 of them and have 3 of them succeed, right? If you're gonna make 2 of them, you're probably gonna lose all your money. So it's a different senior. But I've found it's a lot easier to get venture capital interest now remotely. There's a lot of the companies that used to only do deals for people within 5 miles of Menlo Park in Silicon Valley are now open to at least seed funding people outside of that, right? Often they want you, once you start succeeding, oh, it's time to move to Silicon Valley, right? You can debate that, but.
I was going to ask you that as a follow-up question. If you were to start your own venture, would you look for, like, do you know people that would actually, you would go to for that investment and then still stay here?
One of the issues working at Google is you don't meet people in the startup scene. You don't learn the venture capitalists, right? In some ways, you meet the people who have chosen the safe route, who are gonna work at the big company. Google would buy companies, and you'd meet these entrepreneurial types, and within 2 years, their options had vested, and they were off to do their next thing, right? It's good for them if that's what they like to do, but I know a few people. Like, I'm sure I could put out some feelers and get a dozen hits, but I'm not good friends with VC guys or anything like that.
So you compare Calgary in Silicon Valley, would you say like Vancouver would be a place in the middle for a good
Vancouver, the housing costs are still pretty crazy. Although Vancouver, if you're gonna live in Surrey or something, it's not quite as bad. Silicon Valley is a valley, right? There's an ocean, there's 2 big mountain ranges. And so if you live beyond the mountain ranges, you're talking a 2-hour commute. And there's no good public transit. Maybe your employer runs a shuttle bus. Google actually runs one from Livermore. It's 2.5 hours each way. But in Livermore, you can buy a house for $800,000. You want to live on a bus your whole life? Right. I think Vancouver, obviously on the governance side, it's a lot more reasonable. Vancouver seems to be able to build big projects when they need them. And, so I think I'd be less annoyed that the schools are starving and that kind of thing. But you lose all the benefits of having the VC community, having all the people available to hire. And salaries in Vancouver are not as high as they are in Silicon Valley. So
I don't actually think they're as high as they are here on average, which is surprising.
Depends on the industry. The gaming industry is notoriously bad at paying, and it is a very big industry in Vancouver. So I would not recommend working in the gaming industry.
Yeah, I knew a recruiter for a software company in Vancouver, and that specifically was a bit of their strategy. We pay you less because you get to live in Vancouver. If you want to come out here, like, we want you to pay less. So it's like they're focused on come out early here,
Yeah.
get the lifestyle here, we'll give you a check and you get office.
Silicon Valley is starting to have some of that feel where, if you're single and you can afford to split a 3-bedroom apartment with 2 other guys, sure, live in Silicon Valley, somewhere fancy, work at a startup, do all that. But it's tough for families now. I know a lot of guys that I worked with. Both of the adults were engineers or lawyer or whatever, making good money. And one of them bought a 1,200 square foot, 80-year-old house for $1.5 million in a bad school district.
It sounds like Vancouver.
And so I know a lot of families are not happy there, and so you get it on your resume. Yeah, I worked at the big company in Silicon Valley, and then I moved on. And so I think that's a trend that we're going to see more of. And if Calgary can sort of sell itself as a place where you can land with your family, right? If you want to live in the suburbs, we've got brand new suburbs, we've got, you know, cheaper suburbs, we've got downtown. You want to live in a condo with it, you know, sure. It's all available here, which is really sort of unique. If you look at the best cities in the world, you know, the Economist's livability rate, Calgary ranked number 5. If you just look at that list, expensive, 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 Calgary, expensive, expensive, right? And I know people here think Calgary's expensive, right? But you're comparing yourself to Red Deer again, which is not somewhere I'm gonna live. So, like, you compare it to any of the big cities in Europe or in Australia, and Calgary's very, very inexpensive for housing. And so, I think there's potential here. I think the industry needs to grow there. So.
Do you find, are you finding that amongst your peers, like similar age at Google or otherwise at other companies in the Valley, that you know, they got there in their early 20s kind of thing, they've been there for a while, and then they want to kind of move on with their lives, you know, start to have kids, family, that kind of thing. Did you find other people in that kind of same situation?
There's some, yeah.
It's time to move elsewhere?
I know people who've moved to a number of other cities from Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
Like every year, another one of my friends would move away, and then this year I was the friend who moved away, and so it's kind of sad, but a lot of it depends on people who bought a house.
Yeah.
You know, just they bit the bullet and pooled every dollar they had and bought a house 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Well, they have a house now, so they don't have to leave. Right? Versus the guy who said, oh, housing prices are ridiculous, right? I'm sure they're going to come down. Well, now they'll never buy a house, right? And to be fair, housing prices were ridiculous 5 and 10 years ago, but they're utterly ridiculous now, and so it's hard. Most of the people who choose to stay are people from India or China or something where, you know, going home is not really something they want to do, and so they're
They'll
looking.
take the risk of that.
They're looking, you know, well, do I want to stay in the States? Do I want to go to Europe? Do I want to go to Australia? And well, they already live in Silicon Valley, so maybe they'll stay. But a lot of the people who grew up in Europe or grew up in Canada or whatever, a lot of them are moving home.
So is it kind of maybe reaching a stage of maturity? That, or is there just like an endless stream of young guys that want to move there?
The weird thing at Google is that because the company is growing 20% year over year or whatever, and most of the new hires are like straight out of college or whatever, there's always way more young guys than old guys, right? So me and my peers was a tiny part of the company. Most of the company were new guys.
Yeah.
And so the new guys all are optimistic that they'll eventually get a big raise and, you know, hit the stock lottery and buy a house or something. And when I look at it, I'm like, well, I bought a house 5 years ago, so hooray for me, but it's not big enough, so, you know, versus the people who never bought a house. Some of them, you know, I made as much money appreciation on my house as I did salary some years. Whoa, right? That's and when I bought a house that I thought was overpriced and made a ton of money on it. So I can't blame people for not buying a house, but it's tough. All right, well, my beer's done. Talk amongst yourselves. Come meet this HustleCo guys.
Well done, sir.